As of 2024, Benton County has 5 barns listed on the Heritage Barn Registry. These barns represent a lineage that is paramount to the history of the state and Benton County itself. Washington Territory was formed from Oregon Territory in 1853. By 1865, enough population growth had occurred to create Yakima County. Additionally, the Northern Pacific Railroad was built through the Yakima Valley and over Stampede Pass in the Cascade Mountains. Within a year, Washington Territory had enough population for statehood. In March 1905, Benton County was carved from the eastern portion of Yakima County and a small portion of Klickitat along the Columbia River. Rattlesnake Mountain to the north of the county and Horseheaven Hills to the south were primarily agricultural areas of dry land farming used for raising grain and grazing cattle, horses, and sheep. By this time, most of the valley acreage along the Yakima and Columbia rivers consisted of smaller, irrigated farms that raised hay, alfalfa, fruit, dairy, cattle, and produce. Because of this deep agricultural heritage, there are historic barns all over the state of Washington.
Barns are just a symbol of our agricultural heritage, and I do have a love for them. My name is Jerry Honeyford. I am chair of the Heritage Barn Committee. We started this program in 2007. The story of that is quite amazing, actually. In 2006, Jim and I, my husband, went up to Bickleton, an area he represented at the time. And we turned the corner to go into Bickleton, and to my right I saw a pile of barnwood, a barn that I had seen since my youth on that corner. And we just looked at each other and said, we have to do something about these barns because there aren't going to be any left. And everybody told me you'll never get it through the first time. But I and Allison, the head of the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, went to every office, 147 of them. And the bill passed in March of 2007 and was signed by the governor in April, I believe, of 2007. I was just determined to get it done the first time so we could save some of these barns, at least help save them. I remember my grandpa's barn, how even on the hottest day, we'd go in there and it would be cool and quiet. And I just loved sitting in that barn, and it didn't always smell so good, but it was a wonderful place.
Barn. Yeah, to get your barn registered, we tried to make it as easy as possible for folks. Oftentimes designation, getting something designated is a hard thing to do. So we made it kind of easy. It's really just a 2-page form. The idea is to kind of fill in the blank, check off the box sort of piece, and then there's a narrative. So tell us the history. What do you know about the barn? And we're looking for barns that are at least 50 years old. So, which is obviously changing every year. We're up to 1974 this year. And then we're looking for barns, if you meet the age criteria, generally we're looking for barns that are intact in terms of no alterations to the barn. I'm a city guy, and the more that I've learned about the history of barns, the more fascinated that I am. And there's so many different variations out there. Based on not only the design of the barn itself, but when you get inside these barns, different technologies were used for truss systems and construction methods, which is really fascinating to see. Not every barn is the same, even though it might look the same from the outside. I would say my role as the state architectural historian is not only do I run the programs from the governmental paperwork sort of perspective, but also just to educate people about the history of barns and other resources, and try and get people excited about preserving their history. So instead of looking at something, via photograph, we can actually visit these places and try and understand our history from that real practical perspective of being there.
My name is Jason Ochberger, and my family and I moved here in February of 21. When our agent showed us this property for the first time, we pulled in and we parked right by the barn. And my wife and I were like, oh my goodness, and we were amazed. And we walked through the barn first before we saw the house, before we saw the shop, or anything else. We walked through the barn first. And I specifically remember walking out of the barn going, sold, we're buying it. To be able to meet Merlin and talk with him about it and hear, all of his stories, it's just a wonderful thing.
My name is Merlin Lane. I was raised basically in Grandview. This is where my mom, of course, was raised here on the farm. I was born in 1938, spent a lot of time as a youngster here on the farm because, of course, we only lived just 6 or 7 miles away. At that time, the farm was what I would call an old-fashioned farm, like a little bit of everything. There were fruit trees. He had 2 horses that basically did all the work for as far as the cutting the hay, and my grandfather was a carpenter by trade, so I guess you could say he was a farmer, and he was a carpenter. And I can remember our little rifle that he made for me out of wood. And he also made this small wheelbarrow for me. And then I found a license plate and decided that would be cute to put on the wheelbarrow. He was what you would call a natural born leader, I think, and had the respect of so many people here in town. That was one thing that I had learned early on too. This has really been amazing to come back and see the farm pretty much the way it was when I was a boy. Now that's not to say that the alfalfa field, the dairy, the chicken run and house, the garden, a lot of those things I realize have gone.
There. Grandma, I can remember when I was a little boy, I'd go up on the rock pile and she'd read me poems.
And I think oftentimes there are questions that I had wished I'd asked my grandparents and my parents about life, about early on. Those things, you just don't think about them when you're a kid. As I remember being here with my grandparents was the respect, to the care that they gave to me, the love that they showed. I mean, that's what really stands out to me.
There are historic barns all over the state of Washington. Many are in disrepair and in danger of being lost.
Historic barns statewide face a number of risk factors. My name is Chris Moore. I'm the Executive Director with the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. The Washington Trust is a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization that works to save historic places across the state. We got involved with the state's Heritage Barn program because it was one of our advocacy campaigns. One of the goals of setting up the barn program was really to acknowledge these fantastic historic buildings and to validate, I think, what so many people across the state know. I've got this great barn, I've got this building that means so much to my family and to the rural history and agricultural heritage of the state. The great thing that the legislation did, and that the legislature has continued to fund since 2007, is matching grants to support the rehabilitation of those barns. Now, that's a separate process. Once your barn is listed on the Heritage Barn Register, a barn owner is eligible to apply for grants. That form has a little bit more process to it. Really what we're trying to find out is what are the capital needs for that building and how do you intend to fix it? And then of course we need to see a budget to go with that and details on how you want to do the work and those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the Heritage Barn nomination form is the history, gets you on the register. The grant application is, hey, I need X amount of money to help support making repairs, doing rehabilitation to the barn, and ensuring that it'll stay standing for, hopefully another 50 to 100 years.
There's one, we gave the barn a grant, but the winter before, in a windstorm, it fell down. And a company in the Tri-Cities lent them a crane, and they actually picked up that roof with the crane and built the barn around it. That was the most amazing thing.
If you do receive grants to help support repairs to the barn, the first requirement is that all work must meet what we call the Secretary of Interior standards for the rehabilitation of historic properties, which is a really long way of saying you just want to treat your barn in a historically appropriate manner when you do repairs. So it's how you do the work, following those standards. And then we do require that all barn owners enter into a temporary preservation easement once the project is complete. That preservation easement simply says you will maintain the barn to a standard that keeps it historic for the term of the easement. And that easement term is dependent on the amount of funding someone gets. During that easement time, we do annual monitoring, which basically says, hey, send us images of your barn each year and let us know if you made any changes or if any repairs were needed. We know buildings change over time. They might need to be used in different ways from when they were originally built 100 years ago. They just come to us, we work with them and with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation to ensure those changes are historically appropriate. Engaging in this process and actually working on it has really, I think, energized people and got them intrigued about whether it's their family's history if they've owned the barn for multiple generations, or the history of a place or a site if there's someone who just moved to the property a couple years ago and acquired it. So there's this curiosity about our history, and then this real, again, validation, this real just sense of I'm doing something important by preserving this barn. That is a palpable feeling that I think folks have, and they express it to us and to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation all the time, both throughout the projects and when they're done. And it's so great to hear people talk about how finished my project and I can't tell you how many neighbors stopped by and have just said thank you, thank you for preserving this piece of our history. We acknowledge that it does take a lot of work. Finding a contractor, getting an application in place, actually implementing a project, mostly among people who have day jobs as well, right? Like folks are working, whether they're active farmers and trying to do this within their schedule for farming, or if people have other jobs and happen to live on a property with a barn. Either way, it's a lot of work.
At Milne's, I did shift work. A lot of times I was off during the daytime, so I was able to do a lot of the work. I replaced all the fencing on this 40-acre property, and I reused everything. The only thing I brought in were screws to hold the metal down and welding rod. Everything else was on the property or out of a building I tore down up on the hill. And I also used the metal pipe that's in the ground, all came from Milne Fruit when they were remodeling. Instead of them just scrapping it out, I brought it out here and used it for fence posts and other things. I used the barn mainly to store hay, and in these inside corners, I used that for sick cows and that type of stuff. At one time I was up to about 30 head of cattle on this place. You got the house, the garage, and that chicken coop, and the barn. Everything else on the property I built. I built that. I built all these lean-tos and covers. My dad was superintendent of schools, and we did the stuff on the side to try and just help out with the family, because there was 5 of us kids, and we were milking cows and raising chickens because you couldn't afford to feed whole milk to that many kids. I subdivided it off to help put my kids through school. That was the only way I could afford college tuition.
The constant reselling of this property has the potential to overwrite its vital agricultural history. The barn is located on a farm originally established by Clark Elmer DeBow, who moved to Prosser, Washington in 1906. DeBow was always an active part of his community. He was seated as county commissioner in 1923 and went on to have a great effect on the area. He also championed the building of a permanent Benton County courthouse. Like the Groff Barn, the Dober Barn holds the key to a large aspect of its area's development.
The Dober Barn has always been an important landmark in Whitstrand. It is my understanding that it was built in a Scandinavian style in the early years of the 1900s. The person who created this beautiful rock work also created a number of small outbuildings. One can be seen on the Hinserling Road, just north of Prosser. Another is a water fountain here in the Prosser City Park. Of course, people who study Western history and American history understand that the railroads were granted enormous tracts of land so that they could sell them, develop them, and pay the country back for the expansion westward. So that's what happened at Whitstrand. Most of the early residents were Norwegians. Most of them came from the town of Bergen, Norway. Most of them had known each other in the old country, and Whitstrand still reflects that heritage, not only at the Dober barn with the beautiful rock work, but also with the older homes in the area that reflect a traditional Norwegian style of architecture.
Barns often carry cultural significance, and the Owens barn, now Tulip Springs, is no exception. Cattle and horses were essential to early settlers in Benton County. The Owens family raised cattle. Their sons, Harvey and Franklin, became known locally for excelling in rodeo competitions. Franklin's daughter Barbara had the same knack for equestrian work. She helped to raise and train the family's horses and was even the queen of the 1950 Benton County Fair and Rodeo. Tulip Springs was established in 2007 by Carol Curry, who had years of experience as a horsewoman and competitor. She wanted to see the land used, not subdivided and developed. Carol reimagined the space, and an equestrian jumping course was designed with input from Captain Mark Phillips, coach of the USA Olympic team. The facility has been used locally by clubs and individuals for training and competition events. Tulip Springs is known for its good weather conditions and holds immense community value in Kennewick.
Hi, my name's Ken Least, my wife Diane Least. Diane and I bought the farm from Diane's grandparents, Ted and Alita, back in 1989. The place had so much history in Diane's family, it seemed like a no-brainer to buy the place and continue the farm operation. But of course, really the centerpiece of the farm was the barn. And if we talk to people in town and they ask where we live, all addresses are easily forgotten. But if you say, oh, we have the place with the barn, everybody knows where the barn is. Well, when we first moved here, the barn had already existed for 50 years, 60 years, and the roof had been repaired several times and was needing more attention.
The most common requests we get are for roof replacements. And we've said all along, if you don't have a good roof and you don't have a good foundation, the barn's not going to stay standing for very long. For typical repairs that you want to make to your barn when you're under that easement or within the easement period, as long as it's a general repair or maintenance and you're not changing anything, you don't need to get permission to do it. We are assuming that repairs may be needed over time. That doesn't require permission or review to do because it's an in-kind repair. You're keeping the barn the same.
Fixing the roof was such a big effort. It's those rather common things that really renew the life of a structure for generations to come. When my youngest daughter decided to get married, she made it known that she wanted to have her wedding at a barn. So we decided, okay, let's make this an effort. And so we put in underground sprinkling, we brought in sod, and it's amazing the transformation that started with putting the grass in and making the area around the barn so welcoming. Happy occasions like weddings aside, we've also had celebrations of life, in particular for Diane's brother Kenneth, who passed away not too long ago. With such an immense view of the Yakima Valley at sunset, it was a perfect location to have a memorial.
Six generations of the Kendall family have lived on this farm. The first was Elizabeth Brandt, who bought the property in 1901. Her daughter Dora married an established Nebraskan farmer by the name of T.B. Kendall. the couple decided to forego all TB's other properties and dedicate themselves to southeastern Washington. This meant a lot of adjustments for TB, who was used to farming the prairie, not the desert. For many years, strawberries were the crop that financially supported the farm. As the operation began to grow and change, it was clear that a new barn would need to be built. TB wanted to establish a herd of Holstein dairy cows. At the time, it was believed that a concrete barn was better for dairy production because it was easier to wash down and keep sanitary. One of TB's friends, Mr. Conklin, was the architect for the new barn, and it was built in 1913.
For 3 generations, it was a working barn and a full-time farm. They raised asparagus and alfalfa and apples, strawberries. By the mid-40s, again, there were peaches and apricots and cherries to go along with the money-producing crops. For the generations prior to me, the barn and the farm was always a working farm. It was the lifeblood of the family. My great aunt, my grandfather had the most wonderful stories to share about growing up here on the farm, and all of that was passed down to us.
In the hayloft, it was so slick from all the hay going across the floor that we would slide across that. Grandpa was always worried about us getting slivers, but luckily we never did. But when we're here, it's not just a connection to the buildings, the house, the barn. It's a connection to the earth, the soil.
When Grandpa was older and in his 80s, the farm was too much for him. And at that point, we were beginning to wonder, what do we do? Do we sell the farm? And in talking to Grandpa, I didn't want to see it go out of the family. And he didn't either. And with our conversation, we decided that we would buy the farm from Grandpa. The farm itself has been just a really nice place for us to live. If I find something, some piece of trash, or some fun little object, for the most part, I know those things came from my family. And we wonder if the next generation will have that connection. How long will we be here for our grandchildren to think of this as Grandma and Grandpa's place? Although we've raised fruit, we've had careers. And that's what it has taken in this last generation to hold on to the farm. It's been as much on our minds as it was on my grandfather's. What do you do when you're ready to move on? Can you find someone else who will be a good steward of the land, and also a steward of the barn?
I've been coming back off and on over the years since 1965 when my grandfather passed away. I've probably met all the people that have owned the place here. And Jason and Jolene have really taken better care of it than any others that we've seen. And that's so refreshing. It's so encouraging to come back and to just be welcomed by them.
Oh, I'm not retired. I'm old, but I'm not retired. I plan on helping with the barns as long as my brain is good. Or until they get tired of me, I don't know. But seriously, we do need to find more leaders for this program, yes. The younger people aren't as familiar with the barns anymore, so it's been a bit of a struggle.
We have an exciting increasing number right now. We have almost 900 barns that are listed on our Heritage Barn Register in Washington State.
There's been over 175 grants, which means 175 barns that are now either fully rehabilitated or at least the most pressing needs have been met, and we can anticipate those barns standing for a lot longer.
We figure for every dollar that goes out, $3 comes back, not only in sales tax, but in business, you know, for roofing, for siding, for windows, for repairmen.
The thing that brings me joy more than anything else that is the continuing nature of the barn. The barn is real, and it has some real history, and just knowing, talking with people in places when they inquire where we live, and when we say that we have the place with the barn, they immediately know where that is, and the fondness that they themselves have for the barn, even though until that time they didn't know who actually lived there, but they did know that the people who had that barn cherished it as much as they themselves cherished having it in their community.